Thanks for tuning in to a recording of the Kingdom and Race Forum with Dr. George Yancey, brought to you by the Center for Public Christianity. Given that this event is now posted for a general audience to view, we wanted to give you some historical context and frame what you're about to watch. In the summer of 2020, the murder of George Floyd sparked outrage and a national conversation about race and injustice in our country. In the wake of this, we held this event to encourage more conversations and deeper reflection. By hosting Dr. Yancey, a leading Christian scholar on race, our aim is to help you think more deeply about our history as a nation, our current situation, and also the leading narratives being put forth in our culture today. We invited Dr. Yancey because while we know that not everyone will agree with him on all points, he believes, as we do at the Center, that Christianity offers unique resources for reconciliation and also a third way, a gospel way, which we believe is the path for the church to take in seeking restoration. And what we are about to watch, Dr. Yancey first goes inside of two prominent views and uses the language that proponents of these views also use to find points of agreement where he can. We encourage you to watch the entire presentation as Dr. Yancey ultimately challenges these two views. And in the second half of his presentation, he begins to point to a way forward by beginning with the Christian doctrine of depravity and exhorting us to listen across political divides and to work together to find solutions to our particular challenges in our community. This conversation on race isn't any kind of official statement of the center on the subject or a final word, but we hope it will serve as the beginning of many more conversations in our community about how we might work together to reflect the justice, the diversity, and peace of the kingdom of God that has already broken into the world with the person of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Thank you so much for watching.
Well, welcome. My name is Josh Chatraw, and I'm the director for the Center for Public Christianity. On behalf of the Center for Public Christianity, welcome to tonight's event entitled Kingdom and Race with our guest, Dr. George Yancey. Before I introduce Dr. Yancey, we have just a couple of housekeeping items to tell you about. First, for many of you, this will be your first event with the Center for Public Christianity. I want to tell you a little bit about the center. The center's vision is to seek the cultural, social, and spiritual renewal of Raleigh. One of our primary ways of carrying out this mission is by equipping Christians to think about the pressing issues we're facing in our city through the lens of the gospel. It seems today we're overwhelmed with information, and at the same time, we're also starved for the wisdom needed to process this information and to learn to live well. Our conviction at the center is that Christianity indeed has the resources needed for humans to flourish today. But in order for us to move forward wisely, we must first learn to look back at the good and the bad of our collective histories, to look back at our own lives, to look back at the wisdom of ancient resources, and most fundamentally, to keep again and again looking back to God's word. Our core program at the center is the New City Fellows program. It's an 8-month fellowship in which we explore what faithfulness to God looks like in our daily lives and in our work. Our forums, the one that you're joining us for tonight, is a kind of a sneak peek into the types of conversations we have in the fellowship program. If you find yourself leaving tonight wanting more, you might just be a prime candidate for the fellowship program. And I want to encourage you to check us out at our website, which is centerforpublicchristianity.org. The plan for tonight is to turn the screen fully over to Dr. Yancey in just a minute for his lecture. And then during the second half of our time, for me to ask questions and for me and Dr. Yancey to have a conversation. Now, many of you have already sent in your questions, and I've collected those and organized those this week. But if you haven't sent in questions yet and you would like to, even during Dr. Yancey's lecture, please feel free to send those questions in using the chat function on Zoom, and we will get to as many of those as we can. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest, Dr. George Yancey. Dr. Yancey is a professor of sociology at the Baylor University. He's published numerous research articles on the topics of institutional racial diversity, racial identity, and anti-Christian hostility. He's the author of many books. I won't list them all tonight, but the one I want to highlight for you is entitled Beyond Racial Gridlock. In Beyond Racial Gridlock, he offers what I think is a compelling vision of hope for people of all races, so that we might begin to walk together, not as adversaries, but as partners. Dr. Yancey, we're delighted you're here tonight, and now I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks for having me, Josh. And thanks for bringing me here. I want to tackle a subject I think we as Christians should think about, which is there something unique about our faith, our Christian faith, that helps us consider how to deal with racial issues? In other words, as I title this talk, can Christianity teach us anything unique about racism? Or is it the case that the only thing we can really learn from Christianity we can learn from anywhere else? Does our faith offer us something that we're not getting in other places? And that's what I want to focus in on. And so with your indulgence, with your patience, I'd like to sort of present my case that I think Christianity does offer something unique about race. Let me first talk about, let's just do some basics. We'll first talk about the fact that we live in what we call a racialized society. And this is a society where race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. One way to think about this is just quite simply, race matters. Our race, my race, impacts how I experience life, the opportunities I have, and the social relationships I have. There is a lot of literature showing again and again that our race impacts how we're going to experience individuals, what we're going to be able to do, how people are going to react to us. So we live in a racialized society. The reality of this has led to two contrasting views about racism. One view is this: racism is something that is overt and only done from one individual to another. In other words, if I treat you badly because of your race, this vision says that is racism. So then I do individually. I don't like you because you're white or Latino or Asian, and I mistreat you. That's racism. That's one view about racism. A second view about racism is that racism is structural as well as individualistic. And social institutions can perpetuate racism even when the individuals do not intend to be racist. In other words, we have institutions, structures, organizations that impact people differently by race, so that whether you yourself are racist, whether you're doing something overt racist, if you participate in those institutions, you're participating in racism. Now, these are two major definitions on how people see racism. And the definition you choose goes a long way in seeing how we should solve the problems of racism and what we should do. Let me just, and I wrote my book 2006, so some of the stuff I'm going to talk about is updated, okay? But let's look at modern manifestations of this. Okay, the second one, that racism is structural, that it's not just individuals that's structural. This can be embodied in what you've heard called Black Lives Matter, right? Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, if you listen to their argument, they use the term racism. I think this confuses people. When they talk about racism, they're not necessarily just talking about individuals as racists, although maybe we're talking about that too. They're also talking about racist structures that impact people of color, a criminal justice system that impacts people, an education system, economic system that impacts people of color. So they have this expansion view of racism. And this is the manifestation of that second view of racism. Now, in reaction to Black Lives Matter, you saw some people talk about all lives matter. And that's that first view, that all lives matter, let's treat everyone equally. And racism is only there when I intentionally mistreat you because of racism. The Black Lives Matter also can be manifested in something called anti-racism. You've probably heard about that. Anti-racism, D'Angelo's White Fragility, Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist are two of the most popular books out there on anti-racism. You may be working at a company or an organization that talks about anti-racism training. And anti-racism, which I'll touch on in a little bit, really discusses this view of racism as something that's structural as well as individualistic. On the other hand, there's a viewpoint known as colorblindness. That's this all lives matter approach, where we look at racism, and racism is something that is what one individual does to another. So the challenge for us is to treat each other as if you don't know our race, to be colorblind to our race. And that is the goal. So there are two manifestations. As you probably imagine, people of color tend to take on a Black Lives Matter approach, much more so than whites. So you have people of color taking on more of a Black Lives Matter, structural racist approach, and whites more likely to take on an all lives matter or colorblind approach. Now, this is true in our common society. This is a little chart that I have up here. Imagine the top common American beliefs, beliefs we have in common. And as you move away from that, you have things you differentiate on. And then in our larger society, you have whites who are more likely to take a more colorblind, all lives matter approach. And then you have non-whites who are more likely to take a structural racial approach, and Black Lives Matter approach, if you will. And that's the way it looks in society, that whites and non-whites are far apart on these racial issues. The interesting question to ask is, where's the church? Is this the way it looks like in the church? Does it look like this in the church where whites and non-whites are far apart on racial issues? Actually, the church looks worse. Research shows that white Christians are more likely to adopt an individualistic, colorblind approach than whites in general, than white non-Christians, if you will. And at least what concerns African American Christians, they're more likely to take a structuralist, Black Lives Matter approach than African Americans in general. So in the church, we're even further apart than the rest of society. Little wonder why we in the church have a hard time developing some sort of coherent message to the rest of society when we have such disagreements. So let's take a look at these approaches, because my argument is that neither approach is a purely Christian approach. And I'll go into why in a second. But first, let me go ahead and break them down. All right, all lives matter. All lives matter leads to what scholars call white racial identity. White racial identity has certain characteristics. First, individualism. The notion that the individual either succeeds or fails on his or her own effort. That's individualism. It makes sense in an all lives matter approach. It's basically you're saying if whites succeed, it's because of their individual abilities. Remember, in an all lives matter approach, it's not about social structures or institutions, it's about your individual effort. So all lives matter approach leads to this sort of white identity. It also leads to a comfort in our current society. Surveys have shown that whites are more likely to believe our society is fair, more likely to believe that good guys get rewarded, bad guys get punished, more likely to think that if you work hard, you can get ahead than people of color. So there's a comfort level in our society that we find among European Americans that's not there, or not there to the same degree when you're looking at people of color. And then it leads then to what I call colorblindness, which really, I think, really typifies this type of approach. That race is something to be ignored. I'll give you a little example. Oh, probably about 2 months ago, I have 3 young boys, 5, 3, and 2. No sleep is happening. No sleep. So I have these 3 young boys. And I was on my Facebook page, and I was talking about, raising my boys as good black men. I'm interracially married, but I'm raising them, they'll be biracial, but I'm raising them, they're men of color at the very least. And so I posted on my Facebook page and asking other parents of kids of color, how do you talk about race with your kids? I know I'm an expert on race, but I'm a novice father. What can I say? So I was doing that. What's interesting was I got some advice. I also got people pushing back. And what they were saying was, why are you trying to worry about raising your kids as black? Raise them as good men and be done with it. That's a colorblind approach. Ignore race. Race is not important. It's only important because we make it important. Ignore race, and then move on with your life. So I asked this question. As a Christian, and I asked this question as a scholar. Is colorblindness viable? Is this a viable way to look at the world? Can we just ignore race and things will work out just fine? Well, let's look at some research. And by the way, I'm just going to say this. I know I'm a Christian and I'm also a scholar. I believe that good Christianity, good religion, and good science will go together. When you do good science, you're going to find realities that's reflected in our faith. When you do poor science, you won't. Or when you have poor theology, you won't. So, is there a theology about colorblindness that's viable? I don't think there is. And I'll go more into the theological aspect of this in a second. But what does science have to say on this? Well, first, we've seen no real decrease in racial discrimination in hiring over the past 25 years. And the reason why we know this is what's called audit studies. And these are studies where you send in an application of a person who is black and you use name in order to show that, and someone who's white. And what we find out is, and this is not changed over the past 25 years, the applications are white, and you control for everything else, make everything else equal. The applications are white are more likely to get callbacks and get interviews than the applications are black, which indicates that if we're looking at this, our level of racial discrimination today is the same it was, that study was 2017, so basically the same as it was, 1992? Is my math correct? About correct, yes. So racial discrimination is not decreased. We still have it in employment. Also, you may have heard of a saying called driving while black. And that is the propensity for people of color, especially African Americans, to get pulled over more than whites. Some people say, well, is this in the heads of African Americans? You get pulled over, everyone gets pulled over and they stink because they're black. Well, there's data now that shows that this is actually happening. The data from this 2010 study looked at 4 areas in the state of Ohio and found that controlling for the number of people of color, African Americans on the road, and how fast they're going, that they were more likely to be pulled over than whites. So, to be colorblind when we're treating people differently. Now, you may say, well, you get a ticket, is that big of a deal? It's an indicator that this criminal justice system pays attention to African Americans in ways it doesn't to European Americans. So if you're a black criminal, you're more likely to be caught, which is the worst thing in the world. But if you're a white criminal, you're more likely to get away with it. So we're not seeing this colorblind reality. Residential segregation still impacts the educational opportunities for people of color. We know that residential segregation means you go to segregated schools, and we've seen that school quality is impacted by the racial makeup of the students, the quality of the school, not necessarily the students, but of the schools. When I was in high school, I actually went to a predominantly Hispanic high school, not a predominantly Black one. And in that high school, they focused in on teaching people the industrial arts, woodworking, bricklaying, that sort of stuff. They did not prepare us for college. I was fortunate in that I had a parent, a mother who spurred me on to college because my school did not prepare me for college. So Hispanics are going to school. They're taught how to be bricklayers. Nothing wrong with that. But we know that if you're going to make more money and have more influence, the importance of education, which they don't get as much. So once again, this is not colorblind reality. Our educational experiences are different. And finally, there's evidence of racism in the beliefs and practices of medical healthcare providers. And they look about, I think about 43 studies, and in 29 of them, they report on different ways our healthcare system are treating people of color differently. You may have heard that COVID is killing Blacks and Latinas at higher rates than killing whites. Part of it may be a healthcare system that treats us differently. Some of these differences are their attitudes towards people of color, differences as far as the tests they'll give them, the recommendations, the treatments. These things matter. So is colorblindness viable when study after study after study shows that people of color are treated differently? And this leads us to conclude that maybe colorblindness is not viable. Okay. Well, what about the other solution? What about Black Lives Matter? Or today, what we call anti-racism. Let's define anti-racism a little bit first, and then we'll look at what it is and whether or not it's a viable solution. First, anti-racism is proactive in approach. It's not about not being racist. It's not about I'm not going to treat you badly. It's about looking to find out where there is racism and confronting it, not just in individuals, but in institutions. So it's a very proactive approach. It focuses on the unfair advantages or privileges of whites. You may or may not have heard of something called white privilege. And I would just suggest that you just go and Google it if you have not heard about this. But that's an example of locating where whites have an advantage in this proactive approach to dealing with racism, how whites are being treated better than people of color. They use implicit bias tests because they argue that that shows hidden racism. These are tests that show that we may have a bias that we don't know about. It's implicit. So it's not, even if you believe that you're not racist, you may have this implicit bias that can lead towards prejudice towards people that are racist. So there's a reality that they talk about these tests as evidence of racism, regardless of whether or not you feel like you're racist. It's important to take action to dismantle all aspects of racism. What's it? Proactive. Let's take action. We're not going to wait on the sidelines. We're going to pass rules. We're going to train people. We're going to have anti-racism training, keep people to look for this racism and to eradicate it. And then they often talk about ending whiteness. Now, many of them make it clear they're not talking about ending white people, like killing them off or anything like that. But they conceptualize whiteness as the set of values that are problematic. And thus, it's our responsibility as much as possible to try to end it. So they're talking about ending whiteness, and you'll hear this, ending whiteness in the left of anti-racism, what that means, and these values that they see as problematic. You may hear ending whiteness really conflate with ending white supremacy, because this is how they perceive this sort of ideology. And they talk about listening to people of color rather than taking over. And this is part of the white fragility message, is listen to people of color. Don't take over as whites. Don't take over. Don't add in your perspective. Listen to people of color in order to move forward. And so these are some of the principles of anti-racism. I will say that how you define anti-racism can vary from person to person. So even this, what I think is a very generalized definition of anti-racism, I don't think there's things on here that are highly controversial, but there could be people who are into anti-racism and say, well, no, that's not what I mean by anti-racism. So just understand that it could be amorphous at certain times. Okay, is this approach successful? And once again, I want to go back to research. I mean, I can make an argument philosophically why it should or should not work, or theoretically. What does research actually say about such efforts? For example, we know that tests of implicit bias are badly flawed. And I don't want to go too far into the weeds unless someone really wants to go nerd methodology on me. But the tests we're not sure what they're measuring. And we're not even sure what they measure is related to prejudice. They're probably measuring something, but it's hard to say what they're measuring. And so this is not something to hang your hat on to build a whole framework, a whole system of diversity training. But speaking of which, diversity training has little long-term effect on prejudice. You may or may not have had to undergo diversity training programs. It may pain you to realize that you went through that 8-hour session, and it probably is not going to have much of an effect on your prejudice long-term. It may have a very short-term effect, like right after you go through the program, we give a questionnaire and people go, yeah. 6 months later, all that's disappeared. A lot of this diversity training is anti-racism. And anti-racism does not appear to really have a long-term effect on prejudice. Teaching about privilege can actually make people less sympathetic for whites, but does not increase sympathy for blacks. There's an idea that if we talk to people about white privilege, it would make them more sympathetic to the plight of African Americans. It didn't. What it did was make them less sympathetic to the plight of whites. And it did this by individuals who were already pretty sympathetic to African Americans did not get any more sympathetic, but then they would look at whites, poor whites, and they would think, well, since you're white, why are you not more successful? You're white, you have all these privileges. Why are you so poor? Why are you uneducated? It's possible that emphasizing white privilege and the advantages whites have in our society does not make us more sympathetic to the marginalized, just less sympathetic to different types of marginalized people, because poor whites are marginalized. So our research, and there's more, but our research suggests that this sort of very aggressive, proactive approach is not very successful in altering individuals' attitudes, and there's other research that shows that it really does not alter organizations. The alterations it creates is very surface. So, colorblindness, anti-racism. Let me suggest something. That both these approaches lack something. And now we are getting into some theology. Some of you are saying it's about time. Okay, they both lack human depravity. The notion of human depravity. This is an interesting aspect to think about. And I think it's an underrated element of understanding the Christian faith. I really do. And why Christianity offers something different from others. And you can take this into other areas, other arenas of ideas. I'm going to apply it to race, but I really want y'all to get this, because this I think is an important separation between Christianity and more secular ideologies, and probably from most, although maybe not all, other world religions. All right, human depravity. First, what is it? What is scriptural backing for human depravity? There's a lot of scriptural backing for it. And I'll just define human depravity as the fact that we are fallen creatures, and that without God, we need Jesus to save us. And the salvation is not just heaven after life, but it's to make us fully human. That our ability to do good is limited because of the nature of who we are. And that is an aspect of Christianity that's very important and has very serious implications on race, beyond, and beyond on other things. Here, let's just go to some scriptures. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continuously. Genesis 6:5. So Here we say early on that God saw that we had evil in our heart, there was continuous evil, and it does not easily go away. Now, this does not mean that everything we do is evil, but at our core, we have this evilness that just does not go away. We can moderate it, but it does not completely go away. None is righteous. No, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. Romans 3, 10 and 11. None of us are. It's not a case that there's one racial group is righteous and the other one is not. There may be different sins, different problems, and there's different responsibilities, but none of us have figured it all out. The natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him. He does not understand, he's not able to understand them because they're spiritually discerned. In our natural state, we don't understand the things of God, the goodness of God. They're folly to us. I don't know if any of y'all have had real strong times of spiritual doubt. I have. And one of the things that scared me when I went through those times was get a really good glimpse at who I was without Christ. Because I really saw, even though I was imperfect and I'm still imperfect, I still sin, that without Christ, I'm capable of doing things that scared me. The natural person, I didn't want to accept the things of the Spirit of God. It seemed folly to me. Certain types of kindnesses and certain types of considering others seem folly. And that's our natural state. Now, I want to talk about how important this division is. Human depravity versus human perfectibility. Now, human perfectibility, it's an idea that developed with the Enlightenment movement, and it's the notion that humans can be perfected, that we can create a utopia, and part of the Enlightenment movement was that we were going to eventually create this great society, this beautiful society. And there's different ways and we can think about it. You know, you can think about Marxian and his ideas as well, as opposed to some of the ideas of some of the other thinkers. But that's the basic idea. And really, when you think about it, it drives a lot of secular ideologies today. The effort that we humans can create this perfect society drives a lot, that we have the power in our own hands. Human perfectibility. Humans will become better with education. This is a big topic among those who advocate human perfectibility. The more we educate people, the better society we can create. That education, in a sense, can save us. And it's not an accident that often when problems come up, one of the first things people talk about is, let's educate folks. Now the question is, educate folks in what way? And that becomes a very interesting element. The notion of human perfectibility is humans are rational creatures who can become convinced to become better. Now, this automatically tells me that whoever thought about these notions never had kids. Because you know, if you had kids, you know humans are not rational creatures. Just remember 5, 3, and 2. Okay, so that's on my mind. But that's the assumption that we're rational creatures, and so we can become convinced to become better. Human perfectibility. We can become perfect as opposed to human depravity. Now, if our insight, either Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter, once again, educate people into what? If our insight, Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter, is adopted, then we can move towards the end of racial alienation. We can deal with racial alienation. We can get rid of it. It can be gone. Just adopt our ideas and let's educate you in our ideas. Adopt our ideas of colorblindness. Learn to ignore race, and we'll get rid of racial alienation. Adopt our ideas of anti-racism. Be proactive. Confront privilege, and we'll end racial alienation. This is why I say that these models, anti-racism and colorblindness, are based more on human depravity, which is a secular idea of what we should do, rather than a Christian idea. So, what about human depravity? Human depravity argues that humans are inherently selfish, and that cannot be taken away with education. Here's an interesting piece of research. We know that the more education a person has, the more likely they are to say that they're not racist and to exhibit themselves not being racist. For example, the more education whites have, the more likely they are to say that they would live in a neighborhood with people of color and send their kids to integrated schools. A couple of colleagues of mine did some research where he actually looked at where whites actually did send their kids and where they did live. What they found was the more educated whites are, the less likely they were to send their kids to an integrated school, and the less likely they were to live in an integrated neighborhood. Education by itself does not make us moral. It may give us the right things to say so we know how not to be seen as racist, but it itself does not cleanse us. There has to be something else. Only by accounting, human depravity says we have this desire to protect ourselves, to grab what we want for ourselves, for our group. Only by accounting for our desire to protect ourselves can we deal with group conflict. A lot of group conflict, racial conflict, is groups wanting what they want for themselves. And if we don't account for that, and for that in us, we cannot accurately deal with group conflict. Only by holding each other accountable can we find solutions for racial alienation. So with human perfectability, you adopt my philosophy, colorblindness, anti-racism, and we're good, and we go on to dealing with racial alienation. In this model, if we have to hold each other accountable because I have depravity and you have depravity. I have selfishness and you have selfishness. We have to recognize that as we find solutions. It's a different mindset. It's not a mindset where come follow me, do what I want to do, and we solve things. Capitulation is how we solve things. It's a mindset, can we work together, understanding our depravity? This leads then to what I call the mutual obligations approach, which I argue is a Christian-based approach, whereby we recognize that people of all races have a sin nature that has to be accounted for, because everyone has an obligation to work toward healthy interracial communications, solve racial problems. So what I am centering in this model is our ability to communicate with one another. And we have got to learn how to do that so that we work together for win-win solutions rather than win-lose solutions or win-lose solutions. That's no longer viable. And fortunately, once again, good science and good theology goes together. What does healthy interracial relationships do for us? What does the empirical work say about that? First, under the right conditions, interracial contact helps to alleviate bias. Under the right conditions, I won't go into those conditions right now, we will be less biased the more we have interracial contact with other individuals. We'll be less likely to discriminate, prejudice. Remember, diversity training does not reduce prejudice, but interracial contact can reduce prejudice. And in fact, having a common group identity increases positive feelings. If I have a common identity with people of a different race, I'm more likely to have positive feelings towards them, even though we're of a different race. So common group identity, which is something that you really don't see in anti-racism per se, the notion of a common group identity. It's very explicit in maintaining distinctions. And I'm not saying that we don't maintain our racial distinctions, but moving towards what we agree with, what we already have agreement on, is something that increases positive feelings. Families with a collaborative orientation, and collaborative communication means we collaborate with one another, have more positive interactions and relations with each other. So if we work to solve our problems in collaboration rather than conflict, surprise, we actually have better relations with one another. We actually have more positive interactions. Collaborative communication in an atmosphere of mutual support creates volitional compliance. So rather than me trying to force you to accept colorblindness or anti-racism, if I have collaborative communications with you, you volitionally are more likely to choose to accept some of the ideas I'm saying. Maybe not all of them, but at least some of them. So healthy interracial relationships actually show promise for us to actually move forward in race relations as opposed to imposing one's ideas on the others. my time, I can see, I got about 10 minutes left. So let me real quick go through two implications, practical implications of mutual accountability. And I'll go through this fairly fast, so I apologize for that. But let me just suggest that this is a methodology that can be useful for looking at institutional problems, but also interpersonal relationships. It can do both. Some people think this is just about feel-goodism, interpersonal relationships. It actually do both. So let's look at that real quick. How do we deal with institutional problems? And here's something that I've argued, and I think this is in a different book, this sort of step-by-step method on how we would deal with an institutional problem. But let me just suggest that if we're looking at developing healthy relationships to solve problems, this is a way in which we can consider it. First, we define the problem. What is the racial problem we're trying to solve, what we're trying to get to? Then we identify the critical core. This means identifying the things that we agree with. What do I agree with you on? What do you agree with me on? What are these things that we already agree upon in trying to deal with this problem? Recognize the cultural or racial differences at play. So we find what we agree upon. Now, where are we different? What do we disagree upon? And what's culturally happening? And to do this, I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes. We have to learn how to hear other people out. Then develop ideas. If I've heard your concerns, then I should try to develop ideas that address the concerns of the racial outgroup. My idea is going to meet my concerns. Very important that, though, if I've heard your concerns, I try to find ideas that address those concerns. The ideas that address concerns of the racial outgroup means we have to communicate, collaborate with one another. Work towards a solution that can be accepted by all. Win-win solutions. I won't get everything. You won't get everything. I'll probably get the things that are most important because I'm gonna fight for those. And things that are less important, I'm gonna let go of. And one of the things about this is we'll learn about what's really important to us, right? And what can we let go? But I may let go of the things that are less important, and you do, so that we can together fight for those things that are very important to us. So maybe politically or institutionally, I can force my will, temporarily get 100% what I want. But then you've been forced to do something, and you're going to sabotage what I'm going to do. And I'm constantly fighting back the saboteurs, the ones who don't want to go in with the program. Or we can work together. I may not get everything, but what I do get, you're going to actually help me make it a success. Really, institutions, schools, how do we deal with multicultural teaching, looking at criminal justice? How do we alter engagement for police officers and community individuals? Looking at immigration, how do we have a fair immigration system that's fair to people in this country and those who have been in this country illegally? What do we do? These are questions that if we went through this process, I think we would find better answers than not going through this process. So a mutual obligations or mutual accountability approach actually can help us to solve some of these institutional problems that have not been solved, that we just keep going around and around in circles on. Now, interpersonal relationships. Good interpersonal relationships does not mean that we can ignore institutional issues. So I'm not saying let's just be friends and ignore these institutional issues. Please hear me. I'm not saying that. But we need to think about good interpersonal relationships because that's part of how we're going to be able to do this. We can learn how to relate to others with our relationships. So I learn how to relate to people of different races as I'm in contact with them and what's important to them. We must take chances, though, to veer into contentious areas. It's not just enough that we're friends, that we're friendly to each other. It's also important that we veer into areas that are quite contentious. Okay. One of the key ways of doing this is through something called active listening. Active listening And it's something that I am to do as a scholar. Whenever I interview people, I have to engage in active listening. I have to learn how to listen so that I can comprehend what they're saying. I'm not listening to argue. I'm listening to comprehend. One of my research is on atheists. I'm obviously not an atheist. I interviewed atheists. I was not looking to argue with the atheists. I was looking to understand where their point of view came from and why. In order for us to have this engagement, there are skills we have to develop. I think the most important skill is active listening. It's not enough just by itself, but if we don't have active listening, we cannot know precisely where other people are coming from. And therefore, how can we find solutions that address their needs? So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of assignment, an application. First, find someone you disagree with greatly on racial issues. It can be a family, a friend, someone of this nature. Find someone you disagree greatly on racial issues. And the issue can vary. It doesn't have to be all issues, but at least on a particular racial issue. Have lunch or coffee with them. Ask them to lunch or coffee. If they're out of town, call them on the phone and talk to them over the phone. Then listen to their perspective. Just listen. Just say, I know that many of you disagree with, about Black Lives Matter or Colin Kaepernick or hate crimes legislation or immigration laws or a wide variety of different things. I know we disagree. I just want to understand your point of view. And I just want to hear your point of view. That's all I want to do is I want to hear your point of view. So you listen to their perspective. You ask questions to get clarification. So if you're confused about something, you ask a question about that. Not to trap them. This is not a Facebook argument. You ask questions for clarification. Talk to them until they're satisfied you understand their perspective. The way you do this is you say something to this effect. Here's what I hear you saying. And then you put their perspective in your own words. They'll either say, yes, you understand how I feel about that issue, or they'll say, no, you missed it. And then they'll say, here's how you missed it. So you listen some more. And then you once again try to rephrase. Okay, here's what I hear you saying. Until you're able to give their perspective in a way that they understand, they agree. Yes, that's the perspective I have. That I agree. You got it. So in a sense, they have the power to sort of dismiss you or not. They can say, yes, you got it, or no, you didn't get it. Okay, so you've listened to them. Should they listen to you? Whether they should or not, if they're willing to listen, fine, you on your perspective. If not, let it go. Let's not go into this saying, okay, we are going to actively listen to each other. Because they didn't sign up for this. You're doing this, you're doing this. They did not sign up for this. It's great if and you listen to them, they come to the conclusion they want to listen. That's fantastic. I hope that happens. But let's not put that on them. Let's let them decide if they want to find out more about your perspective. And finally, I think this is very important. Do not feel obligated to agree with them. I think sometimes we fear that if we just listen and we don't correct this obvious error, then we're not doing them a favor. We're letting them go on with these erroneous thoughts. This is their beliefs. They're entitled to it. Doesn't mean it has to be yours. It is okay for you to say, that's it. I can understand your perspective. It's not mine, but I respect the perspective that you have. That's all you have to say. Don't have to agree with them. This is something that we can all do to begin down the path of mutual accountability, mutual responsibility. We need to learn how to listen to other individuals. In fact, what this exercise may accomplish. Why do this? First thing, It will help us to learn the perspective of others. How can you disagree with an idea if you don't even understand the idea? If your understanding the idea is just a caricature of that idea, if what you're saying is, I do not agree with people who have a colorblind perspective because that's just a facade that they have because they want to bring us back into slavery. You're just saying that for right now. If that's what you think that a colorblind perspective is, and it's not, then you're not disagreeing with their perspective. You're just going with the caricature. Or if you say something to the effect of, well, the Black Lives Matter people, they don't care about black on black crime. If a black kills another black, they don't really care. It's just when police officers kill them. That's the only thing they care about. If that's a caricature, then you're really not debating Black Lives Matter group. You're debating your own caricature of it. Help us to learn the perspective of others. Help us to learn how to actively listen. I still don't have it down completely. I've probably interviewed more than 100 people in this project, on ATS and other projects. It's still a skill for me to learn to hone. So this is a lifelong skill to develop, and it's a useful one. And you may want to use it in other places. You may want to use it with your spouse. Maybe you'll have a better marriage. I don't know. Listen, use it with your kids. You may use it in other venues as well. But the more we do it, the better we're going to become at it. It'll prepare us to communicate with others when the next racial crisis occurs. And I have bad news for you. The next racial crisis will occur. It will happen. That's all there is to it. Every semester I've taught race ethnicity, every long semester, a summer or a fall. I tell my students, during the course of this semester, some racial incident will occur. I'm always right on that. So wouldn't it be great if the next time it happened, you understand where other people are coming from so that you can communicate them in a way people can hear? Because it does no good to communicate to folks if they don't understand what you're saying. I can use all the 50-cent words I want to use to my 5-year-old. He's not going to understand it. Using big, long terms. In fact, I don't have to go to my 5-year-old. If I'm using certain insider terms as a sociologist, I'm speaking of non-sociologists, educated, smart people, but not sociologists, they'll go right over their head. I had some students I was working with at University of Texas who were math graduate students. They're saying math. When they talk math, they might as well be talking Greek to me. And that's the way it sounds. And also, not just if they don't understand the terms, research has shown that when we are, and I hate to use this term because it's been misused, when certain words trigger us, we actually shut down. And let me give you an example of this. I'll give you an example on both groups. I know what whites mean when they say, I don't see your race, I don't see your color. I know what they mean is as a compliment. You know, you're a good person. I don't see you as a black person, I just see you as a man. I see you as a Christian. But when people of color here, and what tends to shut us down, maybe not me not as much because I'm used to it. What we hear is, this very important part of who I am, it doesn't matter to you. This is important. You don't care. That may not be what you're conveying, but that's what we hear. On the other hand, when people are talking about anti-racism, I talk about ending whiteness. I know when people talk about ending whiteness, that unless a person already is on board with this philosophy, to them they're thinking, oh, you don't value me because I'm white. My opinion, my personhood does not matter because I'm white. That's not what the person means, but it's what the person hears. We can't talk to each other unless I learn what shuts you down and you learn what shuts me down, where I can't hear you any longer. Create a larger atmosphere that provides real useful interracial communication. If more and more people are engaged in active listening and learn how to communicate with one another, what if instead of the next incident, instead of yelling past each other, we actually communicated with each other? How much different might that event occur? our response to it. So this exercise is just you doing it, but as more people do this sort of exercise and learn how to actually listen, we can create an atmosphere where we're not just in social media yelling at each other. We're actually talking to one another, trying to find solutions that work for each other. So it gives you some glimpse of this model. It's not a solution here accepted. It's a process where we work together to find a solution. It's a Christian model. It's based on nurturing and depravity. I can't trust you to find a solution because you have depravity. You'll look out for yourself. You can't trust me because I have depravity. I'll look out for myself. So we hold each other in check, hold each other accountable. And one final thing, and then I'll turn it over for questions, is the Christian model, where you notice I use research. It's a model that I can argue without a single scripture. This is a model that, yes, for me, I was inspired by my faith, but we can base it on academic literature as well and academic theories. And I've written another book that basically does that, called Transcending Racial Barriers. So don't be fooled thinking that this is only for Christians as well as this model. And with that, I will end the show and turn off the screen share, and we can go to questions and answers. Or these questions.
Thanks, Dr. Yancey, for that presentation. And we have some questions that have already been sent in, and as well as some questions that are coming in. And I want to start off with a question that was sent in a few minutes ago, and it's a background question, and is it conversation about racism uniquely American? Does our particular history make our conversation different?
Yes, by and large, it is uniquely American. In other countries and other societies, they divide because of other issues, not necessarily race. But in the United States, it is something that is unique. I would say that South Africa is the closest contemporary to the way race is done compared to the United States. So I would argue that the methods I'm talking about here, that they would apply on different groups in different countries. If we're looking at religion, for example, you go to Israel. The methods I'm talking about here would apply to the Israelis and Palestinians. You can look at Irish Catholics and Protestants, things of this nature, Hutus and Tutsis. I think that they would still apply, but it would not be race the way we define race here in the United States. The way what we do in the United States is somewhat unique.
Another question is kind of touching on the theology here, and it's saying that the question is commending you for focusing on repentance, but it says, but it's asking, doesn't our theology of evil have a ton of room for addressing structural racism? Is there a place for the church to also in some way agree with Black Lives Matter or white fragility on structural racism, systematic racism? If so, how do we address that as the church?
Yeah, I would argue that the strength of anti-racism is that it takes very seriously structural racism and institutional problems. I think that's the strength, and I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm saying that the solutions they offer are inadequate because the solution they offer is honestly basically tell whites, just be quiet and do what we want to do. So I'm not arguing that there is. In fact, I teach about structural racism in my class. If we have communication between people who are more likely to be white and who are less likely to see structural racism, and others who see it a lot, then we can find solutions that are workable, I believe, for everyone. But if what we do is say, look, you are not seeing this, since you're not seeing this, here's what we're going to do, you're going to get that resistance. I think by having the sort of communication I'm talking about, the conversation I'm talking about, what you get then is solutions among people who are willing to work together. Whereas I feel that the anti-racism approach provides solutions, or one group is trying to impose its solutions on the other. but the reality of structural racism does not go away in what I'm advocating.
Let me ask you this, and this is a question that came in earlier this week, but let me tie it into your lecture, or actually your homework assignment you've given us. So you've given us the homework assignment to talk to somebody. I think one of the I think fears for the white people listening is they're fearful of the conversation, and one of the things they're fearful about is that they'll say the wrong thing, or also, and this is what this question's getting at, they recognize this is a moment in our country that's deeply personal, and there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of grief and lament and outrage, and so they're trying to kind of figure out, okay, so that makes them really worried about jumping into the conversation, for one. Yeah. And then they're trying to process both what they're seeing, when the riots were occurring, and how to kind of, think through this while recognizing they want to give room for lament and outrage, while at the same time having serious concerns about looting and rioting and some of the things going on there. So if you had advice in light of those concerns, what would you say?
It's kind of a multifaceted question. Interesting. First, sometimes a person just needs to vent. And if someone just needs to vent and they say, look, I just need to vent, I'm not asking you to do anything, let them vent. And that's all that is. My attitude is that if you're asking me to vent and you just need a shoulder to vent on, I can supply that. I don't need to try to correct you. I don't need to try, but if you're asking me to do something, then I have a right to I have a right to enter into conversation with you on that. My perspective now matters. So I'll just use this as a non-racial example. If a woman needs to vent because of the way men have treated her, and all she's looking for someone to vent to, I'm not going to correct her and say, well, not all guys are that way. No, she's venting. She's angry. On the other hand, if she's asking me to help her to change due process laws, I have to be convinced to do that. I can't just do that because you're venting on that. So there's that element of that. Now, I understand the conversation is going to be uncomfortable. It's also going to be uncomfortable for us people of color. We're going to be uncomfortable as well. It's, we know that sometimes the conversation goes to where we're portrayed as all we're doing is whining and complaining. And why can't we just let go of the whole racial thing? So I'm saying that it is an uncomfortable conversation that's going to be both ways. So understand that. And when I talk about mutual, and this is what I mean by mutual. We know it's going to be uncomfortable both ways. We both have a mutual duty to try to enter into this conversation, to listen to others, to be respectful as we enter in this conversation. Now, I've had people who say, well, you're too nice because I'm asking for this mutual element. And, if that's the worst thing you have to say, that's fine. I'll live with that. But I'm not saying, I want to be clear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that our solution has to be mutual. The solution we agree to does not have to be, well, Blacks and whites and Hispanics and Asians do all of this at the same thing. In fact, while I do not want to preordain a solution, my guess is that's not what the solution is going to be. The solution is not going to be that we all do the same thing. Because of our history of racial abuse, our solution is going to illustrate different responsibilities for different individuals. So that's not what's mutual. What is mutual, what we have to agree upon is, I'm going to listen to you, and you're going to listen to me, and we're going to try to think how we can help each other. That part is mutual. The solution may not be mutual.
Yeah, that's a helpful distinction, especially given, as you mentioned, the history and to go back to the earlier question, the particular history in our country that we have to reckon with as we are and your presentation before about the systemic issues tied in with racism. Let me ask you, particularly, we have lots of questions that have come in about the church corporately, and recognizing that Sunday is a pretty divided day amongst most of our churches here in Raleigh. And so one question is hitting at this and says, in seeking to work for biblical racial justice, do you think predominantly white churches should prioritize attracting people of color deliberately? If so, should predominantly Black churches actively seek to attract white congregants? Help us to think through this.
Yeah.
So I know you're not a your primary emphasis isn't ecclesiology, but I know you've also probably reflected on this.
Well, I've actually read a book on multiracial churches.
Yeah.
One Body, One Spirit, and it basically talks about what churches need to do in order to become more racially diverse. It's based on research that I did 20 years ago, I think. And that book probably came out probably a little bit earlier than the 2006 book. It probably came out 2004, 2005. Let me just say, as far as churches becoming racially diverse, there are certain principles that are very important that what we found. I'll just say that it is something that generally you have to be intentional about. You have to look at your worship, your leadership, what sort of message you're sending. It's probably not going to happen. I think this has changed a little bit since I wrote the book, but it's probably not going to happen. You just open your doors and diversity walks in. It's something that you have to plan on trying to have. And so I think that is important. I would argue that if you live in a multiracial city, that this is something worth pursuing if you pursue it in a healthy way. In part, to help us to deal with the racial dynamics in our society, we, the body of Christ, need to be more multiracial ourselves. Raleigh, I know, is a racially diverse city. This is not South Dakota. So I think that is something that people should consider trying to make their churches more racially diverse. I just gave you a few things you can think about. You can get the book if you want, but basically, think about how intentionally you approach this to create the sort of atmosphere that's welcoming to people of different races is something to consider.
Very good. One of the things that's challenging in this moment is, and you mentioned this in your talk, is that people are using words so differently. And so somebody uses a word and then somebody assumes a definition. I mean, one of those words or phrases you've already picked up on, which is, and you've lectured on, is Black Lives Matter. Would you make a distinction, and could you parse out some of this for us, if you do, between Black Lives Matter organization and then how the term is often used, just kind of on a street level? Is that a helpful distinction to make? And because I know one of the concerns that came in with a question is just some serious concerns about the actual organization,
right? Yeah,
being anti, as the question's asking, it seems anti-Christian in some of the things the organization is saying. So could you speak to that for us?
Sure. Yeah, there is an official Black Lives Matter organization that I believe it was during Trayvon Martin incident that they began to develop. Either that or Michael Brown. I forget whether it's Michael Brown or Trayvon Martin. Anyways, there's an official Black Lives Matter organization. It clearly is not a Christian organization. There's no doubt about that. A lot of groups, though, so there's an official one. A lot of groups, like, I don't know what is Raleigh, whether or not there's a Black Lives Matter organization. They may or may not be affiliated with the official one. So just because the group says they're Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that they are directly affiliated with the official Black Lives Matter organization. And so we need to be careful about that. It's also a term that people use. And you're right, people use a term and they mean different things. So when people say Black Lives Matter, what do they mean? Do they mean the principles espoused by the official organization? Do they mean that we're tired. We bunch are tired of facing all this racism, and we want to know that we matter. Is it that we have to push a certain agenda, political agenda? It can mean a variety of different things. And so I think when someone says Black Lives Matter, rather than assuming that it means what you think it means specifically, it's probably better to find out from them how they see it. If all they mean is that, yeah, Black Lives Matter too, Black Lives Matter also, then that's what they mean. If they're part of the official Black Lives Matter organization, and they adopt the values and norms of that organization, then that is what they mean. So that's the way I would treat that. I know that some Christians are talking about Black Lives Matter, and as they do, they make a distinction from the organization. Honestly, I think most people who say Black Lives Matter don't even know about the official organization. It's not something that's on their radar. So they can't be endorsing the values because they don't even know that it exists. I don't have any evidence to show that this is true. It's just my sense is that that they don't really fully understand the organization because they're just saying Black Lives Matter. But if you want to ask someone, are you referring to the official organization, or what do you mean by this? You could probably do that. And then you could get a sense on what they mean by Black Lives Matter.
Yeah. Somebody sent in this question just now, and I think it's a good one. It's Dr. Yancey mentioned there's a greater disparity in the church, and I think the person asking this is referring back to that initial chart, those two charts you had.
Yeah.
And why is this? And then in light of your solution, is there less skill currently is there less collaborative skill and problem solving within the church?
Yeah.
And if I can add to that, if there's an example of you seeing this really working well in the church, that might put some kind of the legs on this answer, that would be great as well.
Sure. The reason why I think that you see that disparity is that Sunday morning is most of the time of the week, and so in the organization where Christians where Christians who are very serious about their faith tend to find their friends and social networks, the church, they're more likely to be around people who look exactly like them. So outside the church, people aren't finding their friendships in the church, right? So they may be finding them in social clubs, at work, at other institutions that tend to be more racially integrated. Now they're not beautifully racially integrated, but they're more racially integrated. So Michael Emerson argues that this difference, to a large degree, is accounted for by the reality that we have these segregated churches that people attend, and so when it comes to understanding different perspectives, you don't have someone of a different race. You can go and talk to them about it, and so you're not moderating. When you're around people who disagree with you, you tend to moderate your views. You're not as confident that you're right. Where that people are not around that in churches because they're around people who are the same race. And so I think that is a problem. I don't know if people in churches have more collaborative skills than people outside the church, to be honest. There's not been any research along those lines. Even though theologically, I think this is based in our Christian faith, churches have not really lived this out. I can't say that there's a lot of great examples, to be honest. I do know that some churches that have had conversations, ongoing conversations, and I think a lot of fruit's coming out of that. They've not been as deliberative. They have kind of felt their way around to how to do this. I would like to see more research showing us how to do this in a more healthy way. I hope to do some of that research in the next few years. But there are some examples of churches that are having meetings, racial reconciliation meetings, where people come together and they try to talk to their issues. And I think that they've enjoyed some of the benefits of that. That when there are racial incidents, they tend to come and talk it out rather than going to these usually are interracial churches, by the way. In fact, it's hard for them to do unless they are interracial churches. Rather than going to their different corners, they tend to talk it out. Not that it's perfect, but they have a solid basis for talking through their issues rather than the sort of stereotyping that we can often see.
Here's another question that gets at some of the kind of, I think these are important because they get at some of the kind of labeling that's happened that prevents some of the conversations you're talking about. And this says, there's a tendency among many to be alarmed at Black Lives Matter and looting and think that all of what they say, including the problem of structural racism or corporate responses to it, are Marxist. Would you please explain why believing in structural racism and responding to it structurally is not necessarily Marxist?
Yeah, Marxism is a specific theory about how societies work. I'll just, Marxism believes that the economy shapes everything else in society. And so they believe that as the economies evolve, our societies will evolve, and eventually our capitalist society will become so corrupted that it'll fall and we'll have this communist society. It is not necessarily, I mean, you can be a Marxist and be concerned with institutional racism, it's clear. But there's nothing that says that you have to be concerned with institutional racism, you have to be concerned with economic structures the way a Marxist is. There's nothing inherent in that. You can see the problem due to culture. You can see the problem due to education. You can see the problem due to ethnocentrism. There are a lot of ways in which you can look at society and have the problem of institutional racism and not have a Marxian perspective. In fact, what social theorists will tell you is among the major social theorists, Marxism is probably the least useful one as far as conflict theory, the least useful conflict theory or deal with issues of race. So yeah, I hear this and I fully believe that some Black Lives Matter individuals are Marxists. I mean, yeah, I believe that to be true, but I know that to be true. But I just don't see how anti-racism naturally has to go with Marxism. The two are not totally incompatible, but they're not identical either.
This person's asking a really practical question, and I appreciate that. They write in, Dr. Yancey, you recommend listening first always, which is strongly supported in Scripture. In your experience, when is it appropriate to offer a different or even opposing opinion? On Twitter and Facebook, I'm sure that's the best time, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, remember, it's mutual. So, I mean, yeah, the exercise is not mutual. The exercise is you and you're doing it for this person. But ideally, we should be creating communities where listening is valued. So, yes, you listen to them, but the expectation is that they're going to listen to you in these communities. Once again, not for the exercise, but in these communities, that they're going to listen to you. And so it's not, don't confuse this with white fragility or things. This is not anti-racism. This is not whites shut up and just listen to those people of color and then you'll get your marching orders. That's not what this is. I do not advocate that. The research shows that does not work. And I don't see that as in keeping with Scripture. This is, we listen together. And so when is the time? Whenever we're together trying to discuss a problem, eventually you will have your chance for input.
Oh, I want to, we've got just a few minutes left, and I know that you're rushing to get done there on your presentation. And I just wanted to give you kind of a final word or final advice for the community of Christians in Raleigh. And we have through our fellows program, a lot of future leaders within the city who are on the webinar. I mean, what kind of final advice would you want to give to us?
Well, I would just like to go big picture for a second, because you probably know I've done some work on anti-Christian bias. And it probably doesn't surprise any of y'all, and probably all of y'all know that we are either heading into or we're already in a post-Christian society, a society where Christianity is not the dominant cultural, it may be the strongest among others, but it's not the dominant cultural force. And that being a Christian can actually cost you something in a way that it probably did not 50 years ago. And that there are problems. And I've documented some of the discrimination that happens to Christians in academia and some of the attitudes that are very hostile to Christians among people with power. All that's very real. Okay, so that's the society we live in. What does that have to do with race? In a post-Christian world, our traditional ways in which we witness, in which we share the gospel, don't always work. Because there's not this common assumption that Christianity is a good thing. So in a post-Christian world, how are we going to witness? How are we going to show witness to the rest of society? I would argue that if the church gets its act together on racial issues along the lines of what I'm talking about, which is going to take a lot of work and a lot of hard, less sweat and tears. But if we were able to model a healthy interracial communication, solving problems in that way, that would be one of the most powerful witnesses in a post-Christian world. That would be a witness that would draw people towards us who normally would be running away from us. So I would argue that developing the community, an interracial community, where we're working together to solve racial problems, is one of the most powerful ways in which we can impact our large society. If we don't do that, if all we do is what they're doing in the rest of the world, colorblindness, they're doing it out there. Anti-racism, they're doing it better out there than we can do it in our churches. All we do what the rest of society does, then we have no witness in this area for them. We can't show that God has a plan that's superior to the plans of humans. Why would they come to us? So I do think this is not just an internal thing, a feel-good thing. I see this as a vital part of the witness that we want to offer the rest of society. And it's going to be costly. It's going to be hard. It's going to be tough. It was easy. Everyone would do it. That's what they say. It's not going to be easy. But I think the reward is worth it if we want to have a voice in our larger society that's meaningful and impactful. So that's the challenge I would leave with folks. Let's put more meat on the bones. I'm still learning on what this means, how to do this. You can learn with me. You have all these people who are impactful in Raleigh, North Carolina. And Raleigh, North Carolina becomes a place where people notice where relations get better. And why they get better? Because people in the churches are actually talking to one another across the racial sphere. That would be a powerful witness in Raleigh, North Carolina. South Carolina, right?
North Carolina.
So I'll leave you all with that.
Yeah, and what a great way to end, that we might be a living and breathing witness, apologetic for the gospel by how we love one another. If we might embody racial reconciliation in the church, that is good and pleasing to the Lord, and also would reflect well on us as a community to the wider world. So that is all we have time for tonight. On behalf of the Center for Public Christianity, Dr. Yancey, thank you so much for giving us an hour and a half of your evening. And I want to thank everyone for being in attendance. We've had hundreds of people join us tonight, and we're grateful for your time as well. Look for more public forums to come in the future, and visit our website for more resources. And you will be able to find pretty soon. You'll be able to find this recording on the website as well. So good night, and God bless you.